Hey folks, I am here talking today about the winter solstice and the summer solstice if you live in the southern hemisphere. So we have the solstices, and it's a big subject, and let's just get right into it. I'm actually at a retreat in Ojai, California, with my friend and yoga teacher Mas Vidal, and I'm about to teach and talk about the solstices and their significance. So I wanted to do a quick broadcast here just to, bring this out to people around the world, because the solstice is a very important marker, particularly in the calendar. And again, the solstices they measure the Earth going around the sun and the extremes in the orbit of the Earth going around the sun. This is an excellent diagram. And of course, it's very heavily weighted to us in the northern hemisphere because most people live north, in the northern sector of the sky of the Earth. Excuse me. But it's also the summer solstice if you live in the southern hemisphere. So as you see this diagram, you see that the Earth is tilted. This is what's called obliquity, which is the tilt of the Earth. And based on the tilt of the Earth, we have equinoxes, which means that the line of the sun, cuts across the Earth equally on the equinoxes. And then on the solstices, based on that tilt, one hemisphere gets a lot more light than the other. In fact, it's the extreme in the orbit. And you can see how here, why this is called the winter solstice, because you can see how in the northern hemisphere, the equator cuts right here. So you can see in the northern hemisphere, we're tilted very far back away from the sun at this point in the Earth's orbit. But in the southern hemisphere, look how direct the rays of the sun are. Boom, right there. They're very direct in the southern hemisphere and very diffuse in the north. So this is why it's the first day of the summer if you live below the equator, but it's the first day of the winter if you live above, right? And you can see this line of sunlight cuts all the way up here. And again, if we look on the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, look at the opposite, look at the reverse. Now, on this first day of summer in the northern hemisphere, it's because the axial tilt is right at the sun and the rays are the most direct. And that's the summer solstice, that's the winter solstice rather, below the equator, because you can see that below the equator, the rays are very indirect. So you want to understand that all ancient cultures, this is another way to look at it. This is another diagram that's a little complex. You want to understand that all ancient cultures, before they even started, practicing astrology and anything, like that, were aware of the solstices and equinoxes. The calendar predates astrology by thousands of years. Of anything that we would be looking at relative to astrology, what we would now call astrology, and for example, measuring bodies moving through the sky, calculating their precise movements, all of that came thousands of years after the calendar factors. And this is part of the calendar. And again, it's not hard to figure that out because we have to time and measure our life accurately relative to seasons so that we know when to plant our crops and when it's going to get cold, just like you do now. There's nothing complicated about that. How many people pay attention to the calendar and the seasons relative to how many people pay attention to astrology? Well, just look at the ratio. Certainly not as many. Everyone pays attention to the calendar. Everyone pays attention to the seasons because it shows the life that you're living. Particularly if we were still connected to having to grow our food and shelter and all that, the first reasons we would be looking into the sky would be to know what season it is, when it's going to get cold, when it's going to get light, And so they noticed these extremes in the orbits of the sun, especially, and built these ancient monuments to solstices, like for example, Stonehenge, which is about, I think it's like 25 to 3000 BC, was built. There are other ancient ancient stone temples throughout, Eurasia and all over the world that were built to mark the solstices and equinoxes. So we want to first understand this as a kind of place to begin, is that all ancient cultures, before they got into anything related to, divination, which is really what astrology is. It's an art of divination, where we're trying to understand the message from the cosmos and something quite abstract. The first measurements were related to the calendar. And at some point they started to get mixed, because then as we started to do more subtle and complicated measuring, like measuring planets, first measuring the moon moving through the sky, then measuring other sky objects, and we started to practice what we now call astrology, we already had a kind of system in place that measured solstices and equinoxes and all the calendar factors, especially the Indians in the ancient times. The ancient Indians already, by the time of the Yajurveda, like 1200 to 1500 BC, and earlier if you go into the Rig Veda, actually it was in the Yajurveda that they were talking about calendar months as well. So they had calendar months that were connected to seasons. Again, this is all calendar at this point. This isn't the zodiac at all. There's nothing to do with planets moving through the sky. It's 12 portions. Now, they were noticing the changes because they were looking in the sky, because that's where you look for everything. But you see, even in the Yajurveda, 1200 BC, they're talking about 12 calendar months. Again, just like we have calendar months like January, February, March. These 12 calendar months, these 12 months are connected to the calendar, which are different than 12 zodiac signs, which are connected to the sky. Keep these two different systems of 12 in mind, okay? So they had 12 calendar months, even 1200 BC, Mata and Madhava, the months of spring. Shukra and Sushi, the months of summer. Nabha and Nabasya, the months of Varsha. So they had 12 calendar months connected to the sun and the seasons, and of course, the solstices and equinoxes. So all of this stuff is related to the calendar, nothing to do with the zodiac at all. And you can see when they come down, one of the quotes in the Vedanga Jyotisha says they're talking about, they actually talk about, there's another one up here first. It says, when sun and moon occupy the same region of the zodiac together with the asterism of Shravishta, at that time begins the yuga, or the year, the synodic month of Magha, the solar seasonal months called tapas, the bright fortnight of the synodic month of Magha, and the northern course. So the northern course is the winter solstice. So you see they're connecting all of these things that are related to the calendar. They're measuring all of these things related to the calendar. A synodic month, which is a soli lunar month, that's connected to the beginning of the year, the solstice and equinox, and the calendar month called tapas, right? I'm going to show you the diagram in a minute, but then it says, when situated at the beginning of the Shravishta segment, the sun and moon begin to move north. When they reach the midpoint of a Slesha segment, they begin to move south. So what they were doing back then is they were measuring the solstices and equinoxes. When it says this begin to move north and then begin to move south, that's what this solstice and equinox is. Because what happens on the solstice, on the winter solstice, is it's the darkest moment. The sun has been moving south in the sky, south, 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 south. When it's at its deepest southern position and it can't go any more south, it begins to move north. So when they were calling northern course, with what they call northern course, or they also call it Uttarayana, which is, as you see it right here, Uttarayana, winter solstice. Uttarayana means the northern course. And that's the same thing that we now call the solstice, because the solstice is the day that the sun can't go any more south. It's been going south, south since the summer solstice. So on the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, the sun starts going south because it's gone as far north as it can. So it's at its most north on the summer solstice. From the most north, it can only start moving south. Then it hits its most south on the solstice. So today in the northern hemisphere, it can't go any more south. So where do you go from the bottom? You start moving north. So this is why that's the beginning of the northern course. And so the Indians connected the northern course, or what's called Uttarayana, which is the same as the solstice, with the beginning of a month, the beginning of a year, at least the next new moon was the beginning of the year, and a season. So seasons, solar months or calendar months, which have to do with, again, like January, February. It's probably what they would have called January, but they called it Tapa. Again, these are calendar months. They're not zodiac signs. This is why I'm saying it, because these things actually got confused later on once they started practicing astrology and they started using zodiac signs. And they actually started, especially later, once the tropical zodiac was used in the West, they started naming solstices and equinoxes zodiac signs, like we have now. In Western astrology, the winter solstice is the first day of Capricorn. Now we're mixing two things. Now we're mixing calendar, solstice, with zodiac, Capricorn, as if they're the same thing. And they're not. They're separate things. One is the calendar, totally the calendar. And as you can see back in ancient India, they were not mixing. They weren't even practicing what we would call zodiac astrology at that point. They weren't even doing it. It was totally calendar, okay? But then later, once they started practicing and using astrology, they also used the term Capricorn on the winter solstice, but it was sidereal Capricorn. And we can see that here. And this led to a mix-up in the calendar. So this diagram formalizes what I was just talking about. This is where you see the northern course. This is what they're talking about, that the Uttarayana, or the northern course, begins on the solstice. This line here represents the northern. This represents the solstice line. This is winter solstice. This is summer solstice. They said that the winter solstice begins in the middle, or I'm sorry, at the beginning of Dhanishta. That's when it starts moving north. That also starts the season of Sisra and the month of Tapa. They're all connected right here. This is what it shows. Now you see, and there's also nakshatras, because they were using nakshatras back then to measure space and time in the Vedas, in the Vedanga Jyotisha. So then we go forward several thousand years rather, a couple thousand years later, we see Varahamihira, the great Indian scholar, says essentially the same thing. And from Brihat Samhita, he says, there was indeed a time when Dakshinayana began from the middle of Aslesha and Uttarayana from the beginning of Dhanishta, for it has been stated so in ancient works. So we just saw the ancient work Varahamihira is talking about. Then he says, at present, which means now, as he's writing this book, Dakshinayana, or the southern course, the first day of summer, starts from the beginning of Cancer, and the northern course, from the initial point of Capricorn. This actual fact, which goes against the old statement, can be verified by direct observation. So he's saying, we know this is true, even though this is different than what was written before, we can see it with our own eyes, that now it's in a different position due to the precession of the equinoxes. But at the time this was written, at the time of Brihat Samhita, the northern course of the sun coincided with the sidereal sign of Makara, or Capricorn. But now, 1,500 years later, the sun enters Makara on January 14th or 15th. The offset is due to the precession of the equinoxes. So now we have a mistake in the Indian calendar, where what's called Makar Sankranti, which means the sun's ingress into Capricorn, or Makara, is celebrated now on January 14th or 15th, when the sun goes into sidereal Capricorn, because in the sky right now, the sun is like 6 degrees of Sagittarius in sidereal zodiac, which is what they use in India. But because at the time Varahamihira wrote this text, the winter solstice coincided with sidereal Makara, or Capricorn, they delineated it then. Now, it doesn't mean that Varahamihira was wrong or the Indians were wrong. It means it's complicated and it got confused. Thousands of years later, it's starting to get corrected now. But thousands of years later now, they're doing it on sidereal Capricorn in January 14th or 15th, rather than when the northern course happens, which, it's supposed to be a solstice celebration, because the important part of that line isn't the Capricorn part. That just happened to be coincidental. He's just saying it used to happen at the beginning of Dhanishta. Now it happens at the beginning of Capricorn. Whether it's Dhanishta or Capricorn isn't the important point. The important point is the solstice, that the Uttarayana, or the northern course, is connected to the solstice, not to a zodiac sign. You see, that's the part that's been confused, is they've connected it to a zodiac sign, and they say at the beginning of this zodiac sign, that's when we're supposed to celebrate. That's when we have the northern course. No, it's supposed to be on the solstice. That's when the northern course happens. So this mistake in the calendar is a big thing. And again, what's happened is these statements that came later also, Varaha Mihira made this statement at the time. Again, we can very clearly see what he was talking about. There's frankly no mistakes here. It's not even confusing, or there's no confusion here. There have been some who have said that Varaha Mihira looks confused, or he seems confused because, I don't know why, but because it says, this can be confirmed by looking in the ancient text or whatever. I don't know why, but there's nothing confusing. It's a correct statement. It's very sensible why he's saying what he's saying. He's basically contradicting something in an earlier text and saying, here's why. You can see it with your own eyes that it's not in Dhanishta anymore. But again, what also happened is in later texts, especially in the Greek texts, in Tetrabiblos, and also in Indian text later on, later revisions of like the Surya Siddhanta, for example, and then secular texts, you start to see where all of a sudden they start doing what they did in the West by actually calling the vernal equinox Aries, or the solstice Capricorn. They're just using these words interchangeably, as if the winter solstice is Capricorn, when again, these are different things. Winter solstice is a calendar event. Winter solstice, if it's connected to any 12-degree portions of anything, it should be 12 solar months, like the Indians did in the Vedas. The Indians had these 12 solar months connected to the calendar because the calendar is solar. And so now again, Western astrology developed this. This is what the quote tropical zodiac is. It's actually mixing the calculation for the calendar and the things that are pinned to the calendar with the sky and the zodiac, saying they're the same thing, which of course they're not. And the Indians have never measured it that way. And you can see clearly they had these things separated all the way back into their most ancient writings. They were measuring everything with sidereal, in sidereal space and time. They were even measuring, look, 4.5 asterisms or nakshatras is one season. So the sun moving through 4.5 nakshatras measured one season, for example. So they were measuring everything with nakshatras back then, which are, of course, sidereal. And then once astrology began formally practiced, the horoscopic astrology, which was a mixture of calculations from the Babylonians, from the Greeks, and the Indians, all basically co-created the horoscopic astrology as we now see it. It was 12 30-degree portions that laid in line with their 27 sidereal portions. And then they always did it that way. They had no reason to not do it that way because the zodiac is separate from the calendar. They're just separate. Ontologically, they're different. Ontologically means in their at their nature, conceptually and structurally, they're just different things. Now, if someone wants to use one to calculate the other, if someone wants to calculate the zodiac with the vernal equinox at the beginning, I mean, you can do it, but you also have to know you're mixing two things, because one derives its calculation and its origin from the Earth going around the sun only, which is what we would call the tropical zodiac. It's only based on this. It has nothing to do with the sky, nothing to do with what's in the sky. It's only based on this. That's why we see it move. This is why we saw it move from the Vedas, starting in Dhanishta Nakshatra to, 2,000 years later, it was now sidereal Capricorn. Now it's 6 degrees of Sagittarius. It's going to keep moving because it's not based on what's in the sky. It's not derived at all from the sky. It's derived from this, just from the Earth going around the sun. As you can see, I put this diagram here, which has 12 solar months. You know, these are the 12 solar months. So it's 12 solar months, not 12 zodiac signs that are formed by the calendar. And, you know, even what we call the tropical zodiac is identical to the calendar dates. They're inseparable. You could stop even using zodiac sign degrees in tropical zodiac and call them calendar dates, and it would be just as accurate because they're literally the same thing. And of course, sidereally, it's not that at all. You're talking about ecliptic portions of the sky, not the calendar, which keeps moving. So anyway, but the real importance of this solstice is that, of course, it shows the extremes in the Earth's orbit around the sun. And of course, it shows this ancient connection to what we would call cosmology and the most ancient things that human beings started measuring. The first things we measured and the first things we noticed, of course, we noticed we were under a canopy of stars in the cosmos. But the first things that we started to really align with was the solstices, the equinoxes, the seasons. All the ancient cultures knew this and measured it accurately, especially with structures like Stonehenge. And they weren't doing astrology at the time. We need to separate it. They were aligning with the seasons, getting the calendar straight, figuring out how many days there were in the year. And again, by the way, the ancient Indians had the most sophisticated calendar as well, especially in that they had everything separate. They had things in the right order. Frankly, all the ancient people did, but they all didn't have such a sophisticated month, soli-lunar cycle, measured with nakshatras, measuring space and time with the sun moving through nakshatras. Soli-lunar cycles measured. Everything was measured sidereally with the sky. And this is the way you can understand the zodiac as being separate from the calendar. And particularly why then sidereal makes so much sense, because the sidereal is the part that's not moving. And by the way, just to say this as well, sidereal and tropical are Greek terms. They're Western terms. Sidereal in India, it's not sidereal. There are two ways to measure space surrounding the Earth. They're measuring space surrounding the Earth. One is called Nirayan without solstice, and the other is called Sayana with the solstice. So from the very earliest conception of making time and measuring anything, the Indians knew there were two calculations, and they were using them, absolutely correctly. Back into the mists of time, as far back as we can see, the most ancient writings of India, they had these two separate calculations. Everything that was supposed to be measured with the Sayana or with the calendar. Sayana just means with the Ayanamsha, which means with the calendar. All those calendar factors, Sora months, Sora means the sun, the solar months, like the calendar months, the equinoxes, solstices, the seasons, all of those things were correctly grouped as being, okay, this is what's happening with the Earth going around the sun. Earth going around the sun creates the year. There are solstices and equinoxes. There are 12 portions of the year. The 12 portions of the year align with the 12 soli-lunar cycles, which again, that's not part of the calendar. That's part of another thing called Panchanga, another way of measuring cosmic time. But this is why the year is broken up into 12 portions, because you have 12 soli-lunar cycles happening. But again, soli-lunar cycles are not connected directly to the calendar. 12 calendar months are extrapolated from 12 new moon to new moon cycles. But it's not measured with that because you never know exactly where the new moon's going to happen. But you do know, when the year is going to happen. You know when the solstice is going to happen, and you have to align the seasons with the solstices. And the year, all of that is measured with the calendar. But it's connected to the calendar, but measured at least its precise timing with the sky, like they were doing. They said that the northern course starts in Dhanishta, and the southern course starts in the middle of Aslesha. These are nakshatras. These are precise portions of the sky at that time that were precise. 2,000 years later, Varahamihira said, Uttarayana, or the northern course, starts with Capricorn, which had moved about 20 degrees. And the southern course begins with Cancer, which again, it had moved now. So they were measuring everything, and I say everything, with the sidereal sky. Measuring with the sky, because this is the thing that's not moving. This is the thing that's sitting there measuring everything. You're measuring planets moving through the sky. You're measuring solstices and equinoxes. You're measuring it with the thing that's not moving. This is how Indian energetics and cosmology, and especially the sidereal zodiac, works. It's sitting there measuring everything, including solstices and equinoxes. And then the astrology system developed around these sidereal calculations. The Rashis laid in, and then all of the techniques came later. So I wanted to just give that update and explain the importance of the solstices and equinoxes. And also, as you see here, I have, you can get 2020 forecast, important shifts for your sign. I got to run now because I got to go teach class here, but I wanted to do this quick. And we still had about a half hour. Once I start talking, I can't shut up until it's about a half hour later. But anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed this, and you have a great winter solstice or summer solstice, depending on your hemisphere.